My father-in-law called me a fat pig at every family dinner. Now he is begging me to save his restaurant? Harold called me a fat pig the first time I met him. I was dating his daughter Alexis for 3 months when she brought me to Sunday dinner. I walked in wearing my best shirt, brought an expensive bottle of wine, and had flowers for her mom. Harold took one look at me and announced to the entire family, "Alexis, you brought home a fat pig." I weighed 235 pounds. I'm 6'3". Played college football, still lifted weights 4 times a week. But Harold, who was 5'7" and built like a scarecrow, decided I was disgusting. Alexis apologized the whole drive home. She said her dad was just being protective, had a weird sense of humor, and didn't mean anything by it. I believed her because I loved her. Big mistake. For 3 years, every family event was the same. Here comes the pig. Save some food for the rest of us, pig. Surprised that chair holds you, pig. Christmas, Thanksgiving, birthdays, and random Sunday dinners, always in front of everyone. His wife Nancy would tell him to stop, but she'd be laughing. Alexis's brother Kyle would join in sometimes. Dad's right, you are getting bigger. Alexis would squeeze my hand under the table, whisper that they didn't mean it, promise it would get better after we were married. We got married anyway. I loved Alexis more than I hated her father. On our wedding day during his speech, Harold said, "When Alexis first brought home this big boy, I thought she was joking. But I guess even pigs can find love." Half the room laughed. The other half looked horrified. My family walked out of the reception. My mother hasn't spoken to Alexis since. Harold owned a restaurant downtown called Harold's Kitchen. Fancy place, $50 steaks, reservation only, been there 40 years. He talked about it constantly. How he built it from nothing, how he was a culinary genius, how the mayor ate there every Friday. He'd been on TV twice, had his picture with 3 governors on the wall. After we got married, the comments got worse. "Pig's getting fatter. Better reinforce those floors, pig. How many plates did you clear today, pig?" He'd say this stuff while serving me tiny portions at dinner, making jokes about putting me on a diet, asking Alexis if she was embarrassed to be seen with me. I stopped going to family dinners. Alexis went alone, came back with excuses. He's stressed about the restaurant. Competition is tough. He shows love differently. Then, 6 months ago, Harold's restaurant got shut down. Health code violations. Rats in the kitchen, mold in the freezer, expired meat being served. Someone had reported them to the health department with detailed photos. Harold was convinced a competitor did it. The fines were astronomical. $150,000. The repairs would cost another $100,000. Harold was broke. Leveraged everything for an expansion that fell through. Owed money to suppliers, 3 months behind on rent. The man who called me a pig for 4 years was about to lose everything. That's when Alexis asked me for help. "Please, Jason. You have the money. We can save Dad's restaurant." I did have the money. I was a software architect, had been saving for years, had just sold an app to Microsoft for $2 million. Harold didn't know about the Microsoft deal. He thought I was just another tech guy making decent money. "Your father has called me a pig for 4 years, I told Alexis. Every single family gathering." "He doesn't mean it that way," she said. "It's just how he jokes. Then he can joke his way out of bankruptcy." 2 weeks later, Harold showed up at our house. First time he'd ever visited. Looked like he'd aged 10 years. "Jason," he said, "I need your help." "The pig can't help you," I said. His face twitched. "I know I've been difficult." "You've called me a pig 247 times, I said. "I kept count." I was joking. "Funny joke. Your restaurant's closing in 3 days, right?" He nodded, looked at his shoes. "I need 300,000. I'll pay you back in 2 years, with interest." "No," I said, "but Alexis said you have the money." "I do. Sold my app to Microsoft for $2 million. But pigs don't help people who abuse them." His face went red. "You can't let my life's work die because of some jokes." "Watch me," I said. "Actually, don't watch. Get off my porch." The next day, Alexis's mom called, crying. Then Kyle. Then aunts, uncles, and cousins. All saying I was destroying the family, being petty, holding grudges. I didn't care. Harold's restaurant closed that Friday. But here's what Harold didn't know. I bought the building. Cash offer to the landlord. Closed in 24 hours. I also hired his entire kitchen staff for my new project. A restaurant called The Happy Pig. We opened 6 weeks later in Harold's old space. Same kitchen, same staff, better menu, prices normal people could afford. $20 steaks instead of 50. No reservations required. I made Harold's former head chef, Roberto, the executive chef and gave him equity. The man had been underpaid for 15 years. On opening night, I sent Harold an invitation. I stood at the window watching him through the glass for what felt like an hour, but was probably just 60 seconds. Harold looked smaller than I remembered, like someone had deflated him from the inside. His suit hung loose on his frame, and even from this distance I could see the tremor in his hands as he clutched the invitation I'd sent. The envelope was wrinkled, like he'd been holding it too tight for too long. Roberto moved past me carrying a tray of prep ingredients, noticed me staring, and gave a small nod. The kitchen staff was ready, everyone in position for our first service, but I couldn't move my hand from the door handle. Harold shifted his weight from foot to foot, looking up at the new sign where his name used to be displayed in gold letters. The Happy Pig was spelled out in friendly red script instead, and I watched his face crumple slightly as he read it. My fingers tightened on the handle. I could leave him out there, let him stand in the cold, watching through the window as people filled the restaurant he used to own. But that felt too easy, too quick. I wanted him to see everything up close, wanted him to understand exactly what he'd lost, because he couldn't keep his mouth shut for 4 years. I pushed the door open. Harold stepped inside, and the change in him hit me harder than I expected. No swagger, no confident stride, no smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He moved like someone walking into a funeral home, slow and careful, like the floor might give out under his feet. His eyes scanned the dining room, taking in every detail of what I'd done to his space. The heavy burgundy drapes were gone, replaced with simple white curtains that let in actual sunlight. The pretentious gold-framed paintings of French countryside scenes had been swapped for local artwork from a community college. The reservation podium where Harold used to stand and decide who was important enough to get a table was now a simple host stand with a waitlist clipboard. I watched his face as he processed each change, watched the muscles in his jaw work like he was chewing on words he couldn't spit out. Then his gaze landed on the kitchen, where Roberto stood at the pass calling out orders to the prep crew. Roberto looked confident, comfortable, like he'd been running his own kitchen his whole life instead of taking orders from Harold for 15 years. Harold's hands started shaking harder. The chalkboard menu caught his attention next, and I saw him lean forward slightly to read the prices. $20 ribeye, $18 salmon, $15 pasta specials. Everything he used to charge $50 for was now priced for regular people who didn't need to make reservations 3 weeks in advance. His lips moved as he read, doing the math in his head, probably calculating how much money I was leaving on the table by refusing to gouge customers the way he had. Then he saw the reservation book sitting open on the host stand, and I watched him step closer to scan the names. No politicians, no socialites, no mayor's office reservations. Just regular names, families celebrating birthdays, couples on date nights, people who used to drive past his restaurant knowing they couldn't afford to eat there. The book was completely full for opening night, every table spoken for, and Harold's shoulders sagged as he stared at it. He turned to look at me, and for the first time in 4 years I saw something in his face that wasn't contempt or amusement. He looked lost, like someone who'd just realized they'd been walking in the wrong direction their entire life. His mouth opened, but nothing came out except a small croak. He cleared his throat, tried again, and managed to form actual words. He asked if we could talk privately, gesturing toward the back where his office used to be. I didn't say anything, just led him through the dining room past tables where our staff was doing final setup. Every server who used to work for Harold watched us walk by, and I could feel their eyes tracking him. They knew what this moment meant, knew that the man who'd screamed at them and docked their pay for minor mistakes was now walking through their kitchen as a guest instead of a boss. Harold kept his eyes down, couldn't meet any of their gazes. We reached the office and I pushed open the door. He stopped in the doorway, frozen, staring at the walls. Every photo he'd hung was gone. The pictures with governors, the framed newspaper articles about his restaurant, the awards and certifications he'd displayed like trophies, all of it replaced with photos of our staff and their families. Roberto's kids at their school graduation, one of the servers holding her new baby, the dishwasher standing in front of the house he'd just bought. Harold's legacy erased and replaced with the lives of people he'd treated like they were disposable. He walked to his old desk chair and sat down heavily, and I could see him registering that this chair wasn't his anymore, this desk wasn't his, this room wasn't his. Nothing here belonged to him. He looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes and said the words I'd been waiting 4 years to hear. He said he was sorry. I let him talk. 10 full minutes of explanation and justification and excuse-making that I'd heard versions of before from Alexis. His father was cruel. He grew up with criticism. He learned to use humor as a defense mechanism. He felt threatened by my size and my success. He didn't know how to show affection properly. The words poured out of him like he'd been rehearsing this speech in his head for weeks, like if he could just explain himself well enough I'd understand and forgive him. I stood there with my arms crossed and let him finish, watched him gesture with his shaking hands and wipe at his eyes and lean forward in the chair that used to be his throne. When he finally ran out of steam and sat there looking at me hopefully, I spoke for the first time since we'd entered the room. I told him he'd called me a pig 247 times, that I'd counted every single one, that his childhood didn't erase any of that. His face crumpled and tears started running down his cheeks. Actual tears from a man I'd never seen show real emotion beyond anger and amusement at other people's expense. He cried sitting in that chair, and I stood there watching him, waiting to feel the satisfaction I'd imagined. But it didn't come. Seeing Harold broken and crying didn't make me feel whole again, didn't heal the 4 years of humiliation, didn't give me back the family dinners where I'd sat silent while everyone laughed at his jokes. It just felt empty, like winning a game nobody else wanted to play. Harold wiped his face with his sleeve and asked if I would hire him. Any position, he said, dishwasher, prep cook, anything at all. He just needed to stay connected to the restaurant world, needed to feel like he still belonged somewhere in the industry that had defined his entire identity. His voice cracked when he said it, and I could see how much it cost him to beg. But I shook my head and told him Roberto made all hiring decisions now, that I'd given him full authority over staffing. And Roberto had already said no, had told me privately that Harold had treated the kitchen staff like garbage for years and he wouldn't work with him again. The power had completely reversed. Harold used to stand in this office deciding who got hired and fired, who got raises, and who got screamed at for minor mistakes. Now he sat here begging for scraps from the people he'd abused, and they were saying no. I watched him process this, watched the realization spread across his face that he'd burned every bridge that might have saved him. He'd been so confident in his position, so sure of his power, that he'd never considered he might need these people someday. He started to speak again, but I cut him off and told him I had a restaurant to open. He nodded and stood up slowly, moving like his bones hurt, and I walked him back through the dining room to the front door. Our staff watched him leave and nobody said goodbye. My phone started buzzing in my pocket before Harold even made it to his car. Alexis calling for the first time, then the second, then the third. I silenced it and walked back to the kitchen where Roberto was doing final checks on the line. The first customers would arrive in 30 minutes and we had work to do. My phone kept buzzing against my leg, 12 calls total by the time we opened the doors at 5. I didn't answer any of them. The dining room filled with families, couples, groups of friends who'd seen our ads or heard about the new restaurant from former Harold's Kitchen staff who'd been telling everyone about the better prices. A young couple walked in holding hands, both wearing jeans and casual shirts, looking nervous like they weren't sure they could afford to be here. I watched the host seat them at a prime table by the window, the same table Harold used to reserve for city council members. Every person who walked through the door felt like proof that Harold's whole approach had been wrong, that you didn't need to charge $50 and make people beg for reservations to run a successful restaurant. You just needed good food and fair prices and staff who actually wanted to be there. By 7, we had a wait list forming, people standing in the entrance area checking their phones and chatting while they waited for tables. Roberto's new menu was getting praised at every table, customers flagging down servers to compliment the food, asking what had changed because this was so much better than Harold's Kitchen used to be. The servers moved with actual enthusiasm, instead of the tense efficiency I'd seen when Harold was screaming from the kitchen. They smiled, they joked with customers, they weren't afraid of making small mistakes because they knew Roberto wouldn't destroy them for it. I stood near the kitchen watching the whole operation run smoothly, watching Roberto call out orders with confidence, watching the dining room stay full while the wait list kept growing. We were making more profit in this one night than Harold's Kitchen made in a typical week, and we were doing it by charging half his prices. All that money he'd wasted on fancy ingredients nobody could taste, on expensive decor that made people uncomfortable, on maintaining his image as some kind of culinary genius. Gone. And the restaurant was thriving without it. I got home at midnight to find every light in the house on, and Alexis sitting on the couch still dressed, her phone in her hand, and her face red from crying. She stood up the second I walked in and started yelling before I even got my coat off. Her whole family had been calling her, she said, everyone talking about how I'd humiliated her father, how I'd made him beg and then thrown him out, how I was taking revenge too far. She called me cruel and vindictive, said I'd become the bully instead of the victim, asked me how I could do this to her family. I set my keys down on the counter and looked at her standing there shaking with anger, defending the man who'd spent 4 years calling me a pig. I reminded her that she'd sat at those family dinners for 4 years and done nothing to stop it, that she'd squeezed my hand under the table and whispered that it would get better, but never actually stood up to her father. She opened her mouth to argue, but I kept talking, told her that her father's humiliation tonight was nothing compared to 4 years of being called a pig at every family gathering while she made excuses for him. Alexis said she'd tried to get him to stop, that she was caught in the middle, that I was punishing her for her father's behavior. Her voice cracked when she said it, and I could see she actually believed this version of events where she'd been fighting for me behind the scenes. So I pulled out my phone and scrolled back through my files until I found the recording. Our wedding reception, Harold's speech, the moment he'd said even pigs can find love. I turned up the volume and let it play, and we both listened to the room's reaction. Half the guests laughing, my family walking out, and there in the background, clear as anything, Alexis's laugh. Not uncomfortable, not forced, just genuinely amused by her father's joke about her new husband being a pig. I watched her face go pale as she heard herself, watched her remember that moment she'd apparently forgotten or rewritten in her mind. She tried to say something, but no words came out, just this small, choking sound. I asked her if that sounded like someone who was caught in the middle or someone who was participating in my humiliation. She sank back down onto the couch and put her face in her hands. We fought for 2 hours, the worst fight of our marriage, maybe the worst fight I'd ever had with anyone. Alexis cried and said I'd changed into someone cold and calculating, someone she didn't recognize anymore. I finally unleashed 4 years of rage about being disrespected in front of my own family, about my mother refusing to speak to her, about sitting at dinner tables while her whole family treated me like a joke. Every stored-up comment came pouring out, every time I'd bitten my tongue and stayed quiet, every moment I'd convinced myself it wasn't that bad. She kept crying and saying I was destroying her family, and I kept telling her that her family had destroyed our marriage the day they decided I was acceptable to mock. Around 2 a.m, she stood up and started packing a bag, throwing clothes into it without folding anything, grabbing her toiletries from the bathroom. She said she was going to stay with her parents, that she needed space, that she couldn't be around me right now. I didn't try to stop her. I sat on the couch and watched her pack, watched her walk out the door with her bag over her shoulder, watched her choose her father's side just like she always had. The door closed and I sat there in the silent house, and I realized I was done being the person who sacrificed his dignity to keep everyone else comfortable. The happy pig was thriving, Harold was broken, and my marriage was over. I'd won, but I couldn't figure out why it felt like losing. The next morning I woke up to 17 new 1-star reviews on our Yelp page, all posted within 3 hours of each other. Every single one followed the same pattern: food poisoning, rude staff, dirty kitchen, overpriced garbage. I scrolled through them while drinking my coffee and recognized the writing style immediately. Harold's family wasn't even trying to hide it. One review was posted by an account named K_Fournier 2024, and another came from Nancy_loves_food. They thought they were being clever, thought they could tank my restaurant the same way someone had tanked Harold's. I called my lawyer that afternoon. His name was on the building purchase paperwork, some guy named Watts who specialized in real estate deals. I told him what was happening and he asked me to forward every fake review. Within 20 minutes, he called back and said he'd send cease and desist letters to every account we could identify as family members. 2 days later, every fake review disappeared from our page. Yelp removed them for violating their terms of service after Watts sent them documentation proving the accounts belonged to Harold's relatives who'd never actually eaten at our restaurant. Watts also sent letters threatening defamation lawsuits if they continued, and apparently that scared them enough to stop. Their whole sabotage attempt made them look pathetic instead of hurting us, and our real reviews stayed perfect. The health department showed up 3 weeks after we opened. A woman in her 40s with a clipboard introduced herself as Palmer and said she needed to inspect our kitchen because someone filed a complaint. I knew exactly who that someone was. She walked through every inch of our space, checking temperatures, examining storage areas, testing our dishwashing system. Roberto followed her around answering questions, showing her our cleaning logs, explaining our food safety procedures. She spent 2 hours going through everything while I stood in the dining room trying not to panic. When she finished, she asked to speak with me privately in the office. I closed the door and waited for her to tell me we were shut down. Instead, she sat down and told me our kitchen was spotless, that we clearly took health codes seriously, and that Harold's complaint was obviously payback for something personal. She said she wasn't supposed to share this, but Harold's violations at his old restaurant were way worse than what got reported publicly. They'd found evidence he'd been cutting corners for at least 5 years, serving expired meat, ignoring basic safety rules, paying off inspectors. She said other inspectors in her department were glad someone finally reported him because they'd suspected problems for years, but could never prove anything. I thanked her for being honest, and she left after signing off on our inspection with perfect marks. Harold tried to destroy us the same way someone destroyed him, but we actually ran a clean operation. Roberto came into my office the next day with news about our suppliers. 3 different companies that used to sell to Harold's Kitchen had contacted him offering better prices than they ever gave Harold. Premium beef, fresh seafood, organic produce, all at rates below what Harold paid. Roberto seemed confused about why they'd give us such good deals when we were a new restaurant, so he asked them directly. Every single supplier said the same thing. They hated working with Harold. He paid late, complained about everything, tried to negotiate prices down after deliveries arrived, treated their drivers like garbage. One supplier said Harold once threw a box of fish at their delivery guy because he claimed it wasn't fresh enough, even though it had arrived that morning. Another said Harold would refuse to pay invoices for months, forcing them to threaten legal action just to get what he owed. They were all happy to work with us because Roberto treated them with respect, paid on time, and didn't act like he was doing them a favor by buying their products. We were getting restaurant-quality ingredients at better prices than Harold's fancy place ever got, simply because people wanted to do business with decent human beings. Harold's reputation in the industry was apparently terrible, and watching him fail made a lot of people happy. 2 weeks after opening, I was in the kitchen during lunch rush when one of our servers told me someone needed to speak with me urgently. I walked out to the dining room and found Harold's wife standing near the host stand. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in days. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she wore sweatpants instead of the designer clothes she usually had on at family dinners. I took her to a quiet corner table and asked what she needed. She started crying before she even sat down. Living with Harold was unbearable, she said. He was drinking heavily, sometimes starting before noon. He'd rage about losing his restaurant, blame everyone except himself, break things around the house. She'd found him passed out on the couch 3 times in the past week. He needed purpose, she said. He needed something to give him a reason to get out of bed. She asked if there was any way I could give him a job at the restaurant, even part-time, just washing dishes or prepping vegetables. Anything to make him feel useful again. She kept saying please, kept wiping tears off her face with a napkin, kept telling me how desperate things had gotten. I looked at her across the table and reminded her that she'd laughed at Harold's jokes for 4 years. Every time he called me a pig, she'd been sitting right there, sometimes laughing along, never once telling him to stop in any meaningful way. She'd enabled his cruelty by treating it like harmless fun, and now she wanted me to save him from the consequences he earned. She tried to guilt me by saying I was destroying their family, tearing apart their marriage, ruining Harold's mental health. I told her that Harold destroyed our family the first time he called me a pig at that Sunday dinner 4 years ago. He chose to be cruel, she chose to enable it, and Alexis chose to make excuses instead of standing up for me. Their family problems weren't my responsibility to fix. She started crying harder and said I was being heartless, that I didn't understand what it was like watching someone you love fall apart. I did understand, actually. I'd watched my own family walk out of my wedding reception because of Harold's speech. I'd watched my mother refuse to speak to my wife for years. I understood exactly what it felt like to watch family relationships get destroyed, and Harold had caused all of it. She left the restaurant still crying, and I felt a small twist of guilt in my chest that I forced myself to ignore. 3 nights later, I was closing up the restaurant when someone started banging on the front door. I looked through the window and saw Kyle standing outside, clearly drunk, yelling something I couldn't quite hear. I unlocked the door and he stumbled inside, pointing his finger at my chest. He started screaming about how I was a vindictive fat pig who couldn't take a joke, how I'd destroyed his father over nothing, how I was pathetic for holding a grudge this long. His words were slurred and he kept swaying on his feet. 2 of our last remaining customers watched from their table as he called me every name he could think of. I stayed calm and asked him to leave. He refused, got louder, started knocking chairs over. I had one of our servers call for help while another staff member tried to guide Kyle toward the door. He shoved the staff member away, and that's when our line cook stepped in, a guy who used to play college football and wasn't interested in watching Kyle cause problems. The line cook escorted Kyle outside while he screamed the whole way. The 2 customers who witnessed everything started clapping, actually applauding because they'd seen how out of control he was. One of them pulled out her phone, and I realized she'd been recording the whole thing. By the next morning, Kyle's drunken rant was posted on social media with thousands of views. People were commenting about what a horrible family the Fournier must be, how they clearly taught their son to treat people terribly. The whole incident put their cruelty on display for everyone to see, and I didn't have to say a single word. The restaurant kept getting busier every week. By the end of our 2nd month, we were fully booked 3 weeks in advance. People called daily trying to get reservations, and we had to start a waiting list for cancellations. Food critics started showing up, writing reviews in local magazines and newspapers. Every single review praised Roberto's cooking and mentioned how welcoming our atmosphere felt compared to other high-end restaurants in the area. One critic wrote that it was refreshing to find a place serving restaurant-quality food without the pretentious attitude that usually came with it. Another review specifically called out our reasonable prices and said more restaurants should follow our model. Every positive review felt like another nail in Harold's coffin, more proof that his approach had been wrong all along. People wanted good food in a comfortable environment where they didn't feel judged or inadequate. Harold had built his whole identity around exclusivity, and looking down on regular people and watching that worldview get proven wrong through our success made everything worth it. 6 weeks after opening, a courier showed up at my house with legal documents. Alexis was filing for separation. She didn't call me, didn't ask to meet in person, just sent papers through her lawyer. I sat on the couch reading through the filing and found claims that I'd become emotionally abusive and controlling. Her lawyer's letter painted me as someone who'd changed into a cruel person, someone who manipulated situations to hurt her family, someone who refused to show basic human compassion. The irony was incredible. A family that spent 4 years calling me a pig was now claiming I was the abusive one because I'd finally stood up for myself. I called a lawyer the next day, someone who specialized in family law, and started preparing for the reality that my marriage might actually be over. The lawyer asked if I wanted to try mediation first, suggested that maybe we could work things out before it got messy. I told him to prepare for a fight because Alexis had already made her choice by sending papers instead of talking to me. She'd picked her family over our marriage, just like she'd been doing for 4 years. I couldn't sleep that night. Laid in bed, staring at the ceiling until 3 in the morning, my mind running through everything that had happened. The restaurant was successful beyond anything I'd imagined. Harold was broken, his reputation destroyed, his family falling apart around him. I'd gotten exactly what I wanted, the justice I'd been denied for 4 years. But lying there in the dark, I felt empty instead of satisfied. The revenge I'd planned so carefully had given me power and vindication, but it hadn't healed the wounds from years of humiliation. Destroying Harold didn't automatically make me whole again. It didn't erase the 247 times he called me a pig or fix the damage done to my relationship with Alexis. I'd won completely, taken everything from the man who'd tormented me, and now I was alone in a house that felt too big and too quiet. My wife was gone, my marriage was ending, and the victory I'd fought for tasted like nothing at all. Roberto found me the next night sitting alone at a table after we'd closed, staring at nothing while the cleaning crew worked around me. He grabbed a chair and sat down across from me without asking if I wanted company. We talked for over an hour about revenge and healing, about whether destroying someone who hurt you actually makes things better. He told me that getting equity in the restaurant had changed his entire life. He'd bought a house in a good neighborhood, something he never thought he'd be able to afford. His kids were in better schools now, getting opportunities he couldn't have given them before. His wife quit her second job and started taking college classes she'd always wanted to take. He said that the best part of what I did wasn't destroying Harold. It was building something that helped people who deserved better. All those years, Harold had underpaid his staff and treated them like they were lucky to work for him, and now those same people had good jobs with fair wages and respect. Roberto said he'd never forget that I gave him a real partnership instead of just another kitchen job, and that meant more to him than watching Harold fail ever could. I called her lawyer the next week and asked him to pass along a message. I wanted to try marriage counseling if she was willing, and I needed her to know that while I didn't regret standing up to Harold, I did regret how I'd handled things with her. The lawyer called back 2 days later saying Alexis agreed to meet with a therapist, but she made it clear she wasn't promising anything beyond showing up. Our first session was brutal in ways I didn't expect. The therapist, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, asked us each to describe our version of what went wrong. Alexis went first and talked for 20 minutes about how I'd changed into someone cold and calculating, how I'd destroyed her family for revenge, how she didn't recognize the man she married anymore. I sat there listening to her paint me as the bad guy, while my hands gripped the arms of my chair hard enough to leave marks. When it was my turn, I pulled out my phone and showed the therapist my notes app where I documented every single time Harold called me a pig. All 247 instances with dates and locations. I read them out loud, every Christmas dinner, every birthday party, every random Sunday where Harold decided to remind everyone that his daughter married someone he considered disgusting. Alexis started crying halfway through my list, and by the time I finished, the therapist looked like she'd been punched. Then I asked Alexis a question I'd been holding back for years. Why did she laugh at our wedding reception when Harold made that joke about pigs finding love? She tried to deny it at first, but I played her the video I'd saved on my phone. You could hear her laughing clear as day, right there with her mother and brother while my family walked out. She broke down completely after that, admitting she'd been so afraid of her father's anger that she went along with everything, that it was easier to laugh than to fight him. The therapist asked us both to come back the following week, and we did. Then the week after that. By our third session, something shifted. Alexis admitted that she'd always known her father's behavior was wrong, but couldn't find the courage to confront him. She said watching me finally stand up to Harold was both scary and freeing, because someone finally said what she never could. We were both crying as we talked about how her family's problems had poisoned our marriage from the start, how she'd chosen keeping the peace over protecting her husband, how I'd let my anger build for years instead of giving her an ultimatum earlier. The therapist helped us see that we'd both failed each other in different ways, that Harold's cruelty had damaged us both, even if I'd been his main target. 3 months after opening night, Harold showed up at my house looking different from I'd ever seen him. He was sober, his clothes were clean, and he'd gained back some of the weight he'd lost. He asked if we could talk without lawyers or family members around, just the two of us. I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory where neither of us had an advantage. He ordered black coffee and sat across from me looking uncomfortable. He told me he'd been going to therapy twice a week and attending AA meetings every day, trying to understand why he'd treated me so badly for 4 years. He didn't make excuses this time or blame his childhood or his stress about the restaurant. He just acknowledged that he'd been cruel, that I had every right to refuse to help him, that he'd destroyed any chance of a relationship between us through his own actions. I listened without interrupting, watching this man who'd spent years making me feel small now sitting across from me looking broken. When he finished talking, I told him the truth. I would never forget the 247 times he called me a pig, and we would never have a warm relationship like some families do. But I was willing to establish basic respect for Alexis's sake if we kept going to marriage counseling, and it actually worked. He accepted those terms without arguing, seeming to understand that some damage can't be fully fixed no matter how much therapy you get. The happy pig kept doing better every week, with Roberto as my partner making decisions about the menu and staff. Alexis and I were slowly rebuilding trust through our weekly therapy sessions, learning how to communicate instead of her making excuses and me staying silent. I'd learned something important through all of this. The best revenge isn't destroying someone completely, it's building a life where their opinion doesn't matter anymore, where you're successful and happy regardless of what they think about you.